Hi, and welcome everyone to this new event based on the collaboration between EVBF, Enterprises Building a Better Future, and the Wilmette Institute. In this series of webinars, we have the opportunity to explore different aspects of what building a new civilization can mean. And in particular, from a business perspective, we can look at different issues and opportunities that are happening in the current society we live in, and what we would like it to evolve towards the future. And today, specifically, we have the pleasure to have Douglas Henck with us participating. He has a long story as a professional working in the insurance industry, and also as a Baha'i. He has had the experience of being the CFO of the Baha'i World Centre. And his curriculum is quite long, both as an active CEO and chairman of different companies, but also as a board member of different organizations, nonprofits, and others that will be particularly interesting. So when he shares with us his experience as a person that has had the opportunity to look at organizations and how they're constituted, how they work, from a very global perspective, I think this will help us all discuss and think about how organizations, nonprofits and for-profits can evolve in the next few decades and maybe into the next century. So welcome, Douglas. And it's a pleasure to have you with us sharing your ideas on how we should design and work in organizations that are global in this world of justice, in a world of justice that we want to build.
Thank you, Vahid, and good day to everybody. Vahid, I'm always amused when people introduce me talking about long experience because it just reminds me of my age. So you were polite not to mention that specifically. Thank you. I believe you all can see on the share screen, can you, the title slide? I want to talk for just a second about the title because there was a bit of an evolution in terms of getting to this title. First, I have to laughingly say I promised Vahid I would joke a little bit about the header that I put on with the Wilmette Institute and EVBF up at the top. For Daniel, if you're listening, or Rob, head of Wilmette Institute, I'll take full credit for that. Feel free to use it, however. Some points on the slide on this title just to manage expectations, if I may. We were looking to combine several themes into one talk. We wanted to talk about governance practices, leadership practices in global organizations. Wanted to talk about ethical behavior of such organizations, and so the part of the reference to the future relates to ethics. The types of leadership that achieve this for the future, and last was the obstacles that one would overcome, organizational and cultural obstacles. So by world of justice, therefore, is meant to be that future state where corporations behave ethically and contribute to a society that's far more just than today's society is. I recognize that defining such a society is a good talk in itself, but today I'm going to focus on corporations and their influence with respect to just such a future. I want to mention also, before I move on, that corporations are made up of people. So some of the things I'll be talking about relate to individual characteristics rather than a corporate structural characteristic, but that's perfectly appropriate because at the end of the day, corporate decisions are made by individuals, and it's appropriate to focus on that, particularly among the decision makers or the influence makers, as well as on the corporate structure itself. And last, a little bit of a caveat. I lived and worked in Asia for most of my career. Primarily for multinational companies and primarily for American companies, later with a Canadian and a Dutch company. So I realized that many of the examples I give, some of the comments I have, will be related to that background. I don't mean to exclude others. It's just the experience that I bring to the table. Happy to discuss other kinds of experiences that I've had. I've dealt on, I think, most continents at one time in my life. I'm happy to talk about that further. So let's move to the next slide here, if I can. What is an ethical decision? I'll just do this very quickly. If one looks up academic papers on ethics on Google, you'll get over 300 million results. That's not very helpful. I pick out a couple. One are these 4 questions. These were posited by a former CEO at Lockheed. Is it legal? Is it fair? A bit of the golden rule in reverse. Is it fair if it were done to you? The newspaper test or the headline test, a very common one and a very good one if this shows up on the headline on a newspaper. And my favorite, what would mom think? Are you going to be able to go home and describe this in a way where you don't get kind of a look with a frown that says, I don't think that's so great? Jeffrey Seglin posited these 3 spheres, balancing these realms in terms of looking at an ethical decision. For those who don't know, he's an extremely famous columnist, Harvard lecturer, author of several books on the topic. And he talked about these 3 realms: financial, people, and the common good. In these 3 realms, of course, you have some rather obvious items, the financial things that you see on the financial statements, balance sheet, profit and loss statement for an organization. People, which he had as employees and bosses and families. You can expand that some, but he was looking at that more directly. But then importantly, he mentioned the common good. And by the common good, Seglin talked about the society at large, the environment, and even the market and the competition. That one might seem a little bit strange, but I related to that as well. As Vahid mentioned, I spent over 40 years in the insurance industry. And one of the things we used to say as we looked at our various strategies was that we did not want the competition to be too stupid. And that was a serious comment, because if the competition were to come in with too low a price, yes, we would lose business and the customers would go there, but they could also go bankrupt, or they could invite regulatory reform. And when something bad happens in an industry of trust like insurance, then that's bad for the whole industry. And so there is a marketplace competition viewpoint that can come in there. But what this does, his 3 realms lead to a concept that I actually talked about, 20 years ago at a lecture in Australia called the Clara and Hyde Dunn Memorial Lecture. That's the one on the left, on business and ethics. And the material for that lecture was in large part drawn from an EBBF publication the year before, 1997, written by Marcello Palazzi and George Starcher on corporate social responsibility. This was one of the first papers at the time that was written on this topic. It was really leading edge at the time. And what those talked about was the model that I wanted to talk about today, which is this stakeholder model. Most of you are familiar with this. That's fine. What I want to talk about today is looking at this as a model for the discussion on what leadership looks like, how one makes decisions, what that future state looks like. And so I'm choosing a model that's pretty common and well known, quite intentionally, so that you'll be able to relate to it, I hope, in a way that makes some sense. My paper in 1998 looked at this model. You'll see that all of the stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, management, and so on, are all the same size. And the hypothesis that I posited in 1998 was that if you're looking at an ethical decision, then you must do your best to balance the needs of all the stakeholders as best you can. That if you are to do that, then you're on your way to an ethical decision. It's not perfect. If I'm in the insurance industry, if I charge $1 more, that's good for the shareholder. It's not so good for the customer. But if I charge too many dollars more, the customer doesn't buy. That's not good for anybody. And so that balance is it's not perfect, but it's what you try to achieve. But the converse is perhaps even more important. If you look at what is clearly an unethical decision, you can always find that one stakeholder is cheating another stakeholder. You have not achieved that balance. So that's what I talked about in my discussion at the time. So for today, when I look at this stakeholder model, I go back to the objectives for today's talk: governance practices, ethical behavior, and so forth. And it occurred to me that this would be a useful framework. The question now, as we look into the future, is what's going right? What's going wrong? What are the implications for how global corporations are managed? The converse of the stakeholder model is the shareholder model. You can see in my clever picture that the shareholders are really big. All the other stakeholders are quite small. In the early 1960s, Nobel laureate Milton Friedman posited that the legitimate goal of business is simply to maximize profits within the bounds of the law. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. And some who agreed with him went even further to assert that morality and business shouldn't even mix. You're maximizing profits within the bounds of the law. Now, let's think about that for a second. I'm going to stop sharing here. Am I okay?
Yep, you're good.
All right, thank you. Look at businesses at the ground level. Look at the little corner shop of yore. The proprietor of that little corner shop knew that they needed the loyalty and support of their workers. They needed to treat them well, and that their business relied on customers and workers really feeling appreciated. Take that little corner shop and get it purchased by a large multinational corporation where you have MBA types, not to beat up on them, in the headquarters who haven't even been to the corner shop, and all of a sudden they've lost touch with what that means. So that shareholder model came to represent a distance from the customer, which resulted in an imbalance with respect to the stakeholders being looked at. Now, this model dominated for decades, particularly here in America. This was the model that was used throughout our industry, throughout the marketplace. It has started to change a bit. There's a trend in the right direction. I need to acknowledge that. A friend of mine teaches at Harvard. He teaches in both the economics department and in the business school, and he tells me about this debate that goes on within the Harvard Business School faculty as to whether or not this shareholder model should continue to be the foundation of their teaching, or whether they should be moving to this broader stakeholder model. It's a good debate, and it's one that is healthy to have. And the good news is the Business Roundtable, an American organization of the top corporations, CEOs only are members. They too, the Business Roundtable, just in the last few months, came out with a public statement saying the stakeholder model is the right way to manage your business. Alan Murray, who is the CEO of Fortune magazine, talks about it in his blog. He was really pleased that they were to come out with this. So leading edge opinion is moving towards this stakeholder model. So while the principle, that's good. So the principle is being discussed, the principle is broadly being accepted more, but the huge question, the big question before us is the question of implementation. If you have a publicly listed corporation, then there's a stock analyst for one of the big broker firms who is following your shares. And that stock analyst is going to be, he's not going to be at the corner store, he or she is not going to be at the corner store, but they're going to be really impressed if you're Ford or Uber and you've laid off thousands of employees, because they'll see the effect on the bottom line and your potential for paying a dividend. Or maybe they look at another organization that has successfully migrated a large part of their workforce from being full-time employees to being part-time gig workers, where you don't have to pay benefits and where you don't have to necessarily keep them on for a longer period of time. So while the debate is going on still at the principle level, there's still a huge amount of work to do at the practical level. And there are fundamental challenges that we need to deal with. So moving to the next slide. Let me share the screen. This looks at a couple of the stakeholders. Management.
Doug, we're looking at a family picture.
Oh, it's nice, isn't it?
It's very beautiful, yes.
Well, let me stop that one. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. You all warned me about this. Here it is. Thank you for interrupting. How's that?
That looks more aligned with the topic, yes.
That looks, it's not as nice looking, but it's more in line with the topic. Income disparity between the management and the employees. And again, in my clever diagrams, I've got management much larger than the employees. We have a major disparity of income in corporations today between management and employees. And just a couple of statistics for you. One is that from the 1970s until today, the ratio of CEO compensation to the average annual compensation of the workers has increased tenfold. Back in the 70s, it was in the area of 15 to 30 times. The CEO was 15 to 30 times the average annual worker. Today, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 times that average annual worker. And that's not the only statistic. There's another one that looks at the top 1% of pay, that is the CEOs from the 1970s, and to look at the increases in their pay over time. From the 1970s until today, the cumulative increase in the income for the top 1% of employees has gone up 150% cumulatively, compared to the bottom 90%, the first 90%, if you will, which have seen wage increases cumulatively over that period of time of less than 25%. So if you calculate that to an annual increase, an average annual increase, you're looking at a better than a 15% annual increase for that top 1%, as compared to less than 1% for the bottom 90%. So this all adds up to the point that effectively management compensation is out of control, and the so-called average workers are struggling to make ends meet. Again, there are some modest trends that are starting to help this. One of them is that they're moving away from stock options. I want to just say a quick word about stock options. You need to be careful if you're a regulator in terms of trying to regulate this. Because what happened in 1993 is that a tax law was passed that capped the wages in the United States that were allowed to be used as a deduction for tax purposes. They capped them with an exception for compensation that was based on the price of shares. This was in 1993. Stock options came into being. For those who don't know, stock options are the right to purchase a share of stock at today's price anytime over the next 10 years, after a waiting period, anytime over the next 10 years. And 1993 was right at the beginning of a 10-year upcycle on the stock market. So what happened was that this one-sided, no downside compensation just soared and ended up making it worse. The result of this tax law was to make the compensation ratio much worse than it had been before. Also, making it worse was that you had this plethora of human resource consultants who would come in with all of these charts about what compensation was, how it should work. And here in the United States, we have an organization called the Lake Wobegon. This is a mythical organization on public radio. But the joke about Lake Wobegon is that all the children are above average. The concept, what happened with these human resource consultants is that they were going to corporations and all the corporations said, we're above average. We need to be paid above average. And so the result was to go farther up. Now, recent years, people have finally caught on to this and said, no, let's keep base pay the same and then we can have variable pay go up or down according to how well you're doing. That's a good trend. But it really was not true back in the 90s and in the decade that followed and made matters worse. The other problem that you used to have more than today was that you had these interlocking boards of directors where I'm on your board, you're on my board. It was only a relatively small handful of executives who sat on all of these boards. And even if there was no backroom dealing, even if there was no handshake, even if there was nothing explicit, the fact was that if I was helping with your compensation and you were helping to determine my compensation, there was an implicit bias there that exacerbated the situation greatly. So management compensation has gotten out of control. The other half is worker compensation has not kept up. Henry Ford famously said he paid his workers more than the average pay at the day because he said his workers needed to be able to afford to buy one of his cars. Pretty simple. That's what they needed to do. Minimum wages in the United States have not kept up with inflation, with wage increases, with the stock market, anything. They haven't kept up. There is a movement for a national new higher level of minimum wage, but it's been a struggle. And the third area are benefits programs that have been chopped away. And I want to spend just a moment on this before I get to the final topic. And that is that this current crisis we have, this pandemic that we have, has really revealed deep flaws in our society, from education to health to debt, to look at the social contract that we have with our workers. Let's look at just healthcare. Even before the pandemic started, there were surveys that indicated that 4 out of 5 workers, not just the United States, but in Europe, China, India, and elsewhere, 4 out of 5 workers felt that the system was not working for them. And the coronavirus, of course, has greatly shown the inadequacy of healthcare systems, the increasingly precarious nature of work, as we had so many filing for unemployment, losing their benefits as a result, and the trade-offs of generations, where you had older people dying and getting sick at a greater rate. So universal healthcare is something that's on the table for discussion, but it reflects how weak we are today. We should be looking at a new social contract. The other one is that workers, it is obvious now, are increasingly carrying the risk of how many hours they work, how they'll support themselves if they get sick, if they have a pension, what kind of income they're going to have. Now, that flexibility isn't all bad. It isn't all bad, but it imposes social costs and higher levels of insecurity on far too many. So, question is, how do we provide the protection without giving up some of the benefits of the flexibility? Let me go back to the screen again. I'll try to do it right this time, Vahid.
That looks good.
Okay, so let's see if I can get the next page. If you look across the world, and I'll start in the bottom left corner of low protection, low flexibility, then you're looking at the formal sector of Asia, where I used to live, Africa, and some other parts of the world, where workers are not protected and there's not a lot of flexibility either. It's sort of the worst of both worlds. Europe has high protection for workers, which is fine, but there's not a lot of flexibility if employers need to manage the size of their workforce. You move up to the upper left and you get the United States as a prime example of where there's high flexibility, which I just described, but low protection, which we have been hurt from. But that sweet spot, high protection, high flexibility, doesn't happen very often, but here are 4 countries, Australia, Denmark, Japan, and New Zealand, that seem to have managed that balance in a nice way, where workers can be protected. There is a social contract. It's a new social, or for us would be a new social contract. And also at the same time, employers are not just hammered in by saying, in order to survive, I have to be able to manage the workforce in a better way. That perfect combination is what we need to look for the future. The last topic, before I finish the formal part, relates to going back to Seglin's common good, or this is the community that we're talking about. It goes beyond the relationship of management and employees, which I was just talking about with that social contract, but relates to the corporation's place in the society at large, and particularly as it relates and it coordinates with the regulators. There are a couple of important elements with respect to this. I'll just leave the slides on. These aren't long. One is the environment. The forgotten stakeholder often, too often, is the planet. The costs of many business activities, particularly in agriculture, does not include the costs outside of the traditional corporate financials. And we're paying a price for this, and it's getting worse fast. These different costs, external costs or externalities associated with food, include things like ecological effects, the environmental quality, greenhouse gases, animal welfare. These social costs are not part of today's financial statements, the profit and loss of the balance sheet, but they do come home to roost at some point in the future. So how do we find that way to be able to look at that today? ESG movements, many of the EBBF people are very familiar with this. ESG movements are moving in this direction to get analysts, to get people to pay more attention to it, because looking at the long term, these are part of the success of an organization. And yet, in the short term, the quarterly reporting that we're doing, the quarterly analysis, often exclude these items. And the last point here would be social welfare programs. social welfare programs, and I'm talking about now government programs for welfare, for helping out people who are in a position where they need this, those that are designed to alleviate poverty, and particularly those that are designed to help children and young adults, they pay for themselves. I'm not making this up. Literally, I was aware of this, but just last Sunday in the New York Times, there was an article by two Harvard economists that showed that these programs pay for themselves. They don't pay for themselves over 6 months, that's true, but it's like an investment in the future that very clearly and demonstrably pays back over time. So we need to be looking at these social programs in a way that's a bit different from what we've looked at before. So I move back to my stakeholder model. The stakeholder model, where all those stakeholders now are back to the same size. I will stop. You've seen this before, so I don't need to continue to share this. What is that world of the future then that we're looking at? Ethical behavior, where we started, how you define ethics. There are multiple ways to do it, but looking at these stakeholders. Management practices that are value-driven leadership, creating that environment where employees either make the ethically right decision or understand that it's an ethical decision to be made, and they broaden the group to a good consultation or elevate the issue to be decided. Providing employees with a cause that is greater than themselves. In my experience, if you try to hire someone away from another company just by paying them an extra $1,000, that's going to be very short term, because some other yahoo is going to come along and pay them another $1,000, and then you've lost them. You have to motivate employees by understanding the importance of what they're doing and how it benefits society. And by doing that, then you get a much more committed, much more loyal, much more effective workforce. Practicing consultation, a decision-making process, for those who don't know, a decision-making process that develops group solutions without regard to power dynamics. It is hugely, hugely successful and effective when it's implemented well. I mentioned briefly time frame. When we look at too short a time frame, then that tends to drive decisions which are not to the benefit of all stakeholders, including the shareholders, but to all stakeholders over a longer period of time. And when you read business books or case studies about successful corporations, I can guarantee you they don't write books about a corporation that was successful for 1 quarter. They talk about successes over a longer period of time. And so that time frame is an important one. I know quarterly results are important for different reasons, but I also think there's a big negative element to them because they do drive behavior that's not always good. There are practices and models in the secular world that are consistent with this image that I have of the future. In negotiations, the Harvard negotiation team back in the 80s, I think, wrote a book called Getting to Yes. And rather than this win-lose negotiation, it was more like jointly problem solving to get to a mutually satisfactory win-win solution. Terrific example. In the legal world, alternative dispute resolution, where you have mediation rather than arbitration. You don't get the win-lose thing again, but again, you get to a consultative, beneficial result. Cooperative ownership models, for those who are familiar with that, where employees have a major stake, or absent that, where you have major profit sharing going on with respect to all the employees. These are important. And also, not incidentally, the many, many movements towards greater diversity in all levels of management and the board levels. And I'm talking about gender diversity, race diversity, background diversity, all of those things. And the movement towards that is extremely important. So there's the model. There is the problem with practical implementation of that for the future. But I think it's a model where if you continue to focus on those stakeholders and say, what is balancing those needs really mean, stakeholder by stakeholder, then I think you'll be moving to a place for the future. Today's pandemic is a crisis, and my adage throughout my career was whenever there's a crisis, there's an opportunity. And I would suggest to you that the opportunity now, as we have to rebuild some of these structures, as we look at the future, that opportunity would be now. So Vahid, that's the end of my formal presentation. I think I got it in within 25 minutes or so. I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Doug. This was short, but definitely very inspiring to me, and it's very aligned with the discussions EVBF tries to have and share with others. So I have a personal bunch of questions. Before, and then we have, of course, questions from the audience. So I hope we can cover as many as possible in the half an hour that we have left. I wanted to ask you if perhaps you'd be willing to discuss briefly, but your experience at the Baha'i World Centre. I'm pretty sure some people in the audience will be curious. Maybe you can share a little bit what you've learned while you were operating there as a CFO, and how that affected your professional experience and trajectory.
I'd be happy to, but I'm going to need to share the screen again. This is the last time. I did anticipate the question. Thank you, Vahid. And the reason I anticipated is because I know some of the material sent out ahead of time mentioned that. Let me get to the next slide here. I have just 5 or 6 quick quotes that I think relate to Baha'i principles that I tried to utilize in my work career, and that were strengthened during my time at the World Centre. I start with a general point. The future order conceived by Baha'u'llah is far beyond anything that can be imagined by the present generation. And so I start off by undercutting everything I said. I don't know anything about what the future looks like, but I can just simply look at sort of today's models and today's challenges and say, well, okay, here's how we need to make progress. But what it really looks like, I don't know. When I was at the World Centre, interestingly, I got asked earlier, because I had come from an executive position at an insurance company, I got asked by young people, how can you work for an insurance company and be a Baha'i? it was a, oh my goodness, how can you do that? And so I like this second quote. Economic life is an arena for the expression of honesty, integrity, trustworthiness, generosity, and other qualities of the spirit. And so I try to apply that. We're part of the world, and to the extent that we can apply these values to our day-to-day life, even in a big organization like an insurance company, then that's awfully important. With respect to economics, many quotes, I picked out this one: the teachings don't provide specific and detailed solutions, but there are certain guiding principles that we can be aware of and that we consult about. Books are being written about it, although not that many yet so far, but they're fascinating as people start to look at it. But I like this second one as well, because it's a nice caution, which is be careful thinking that it's going to be capitalist. Be equally careful thinking it's going to be Marxist, because Shoghi Effendi, the guardian leader of the faith earlier in the last century, made clear that no, neither one of those is exactly right by themselves. And in fact, if you think about what I was talking about today with respect to some of those stakeholders, that had elements of both. With respect to that. And so I think it's important to keep in mind just what we don't know. My last quick page of quotes, and this gets right to the social contract that I was talking about. Extremes of wealth and poverty are becoming ever more untenable. I talked about it just within the realm of a corporation, but you move it to the realm of a society, and it's even worse, even far worse, actually. And so instead of comparing the CEO to the worker, you're comparing the CEO to people who have no job, or who live in poverty, or live in restricted areas that are so difficult. The welfare of any segment of humanity is inextricably bound up with the welfare of the whole. And I think that when we begin to think about that in the holistic way, then we'll be better. And so the answer to the question, Bahi, this is my last slide, is when I look at these principles, these Baha'i principles, I didn't mention any of them as being a Baha'i principle as I was talking through the talk. And yet every one of them is right at the core of the Baha'i teachings. Trustworthiness, unity, one human race, gender equality. I mentioned elements of both of those. Abolitions of extremes of wealth and poverty. Purpose of life is to promote an ever-advancing civilization. And you will recall I was talking about how to motivate employees. That's exactly what I talked about when I gave talks to employees. Profit sharing I mentioned. And then consultation I mentioned. Now, there's an arrow down called the extraordinary spiritual and practical discipline that is consultation. That's from a private email to me from one of the members of the House of Justice, because I was talking about what makes the World Centre tick, what makes it work. And his direct quote was, one of the things that really make this place tick is the extraordinary spiritual and practical discipline that is consultation. So if I took away lessons from when I worked at the World Centre, besides a strengthening of these core values, was also this practicing consultation in a way that I have never been as successful doing in the otherwise, although I was relatively more successful in my work after the World Center than I was before, having had that experience. The second thing I learned, which I will pass on, Vahid, is that I was working for a nonprofit. And I looked at hundreds and hundreds of other people there working for free. We got housing. We were working for free. And the motivation there was one that most organizations, most corporations in the world would die to have. So when I moved back to the corporate world afterwards, when I moved back to Hong Kong, worked for a corporation, multinational corporation again, I tried very hard to balance the benefits of the disciplined structure and planning and organization that comes from the for-profit organizations with the motivation and the treatment of human resources that came from the nonprofit organization. As part of that, one of the first people I needed to go hire was I did a worldwide search through a search firm to find that human resources executive who had experience in both the for-profit and the nonprofit world. I was looking for both, and I will tell you, by and large, people in the for-profit world do not appreciate what's been learned in the nonprofit world, and vice versa. And when young aspirational people come to me, they want to work in the nonprofit world, one of the things I sometimes say is, go get a business degree, because you can really help them manage in a way that makes some sense. And if they're really interested in going off and, building a big corporation, do some nonprofit charitable work. You need to understand both sides of that, a foot in each camp, if you will. Bit of a long-winded answer, Vahid, but I learned a lot there at the World Center, and I was very grateful for it.
And thank you so much, because I think for all the participants or people that will, the audience of this presentation, I think it's interesting to look at those different perspectives and how we can combine them. And in your case, you've combined them into a career and a worldwide business experience. But now maybe we can move back to the topic of business in itself. And you mentioned quickly the topic of regulators, and maybe we can go back to how you understand the role of regulations, especially in the context and in the US particularly, where most businesses refuse outright the idea that regulators should have any role in the economic life of the country, basically. And if they could have their way, there would be no need for regulators around the world at all. So how do you look at that in this stakeholder model you were describing? What are the interactions you see happening in building the civilization of justice?
Well, thank you, Ayed. It's an interesting question. Regulators are often a forgotten stakeholder when you look at this model. And you're right, today, particularly in America, there's a big movement away from regulation, which, let me get to that in a second, because I think I've got a good example from Asia. For 18 years, I was on the board of an organization called the Asian Corporate Governance Association. I served as chairman for the last 3 or 4 years. This was an organization that was started in the aftermath of the 1997 Asian financial crisis. The founder felt like that Asian financial crisis was a direct result of the absence of corporate governance in Asia. And there was a lot of evidence of that at the time. If you looked at, I think, 10, 12 countries that we tended to follow, you wouldn't find more than 3 or 4 laws or regulations in the whole region total related to independent directors, term limits, the financial reporting, the treatment of minority shareholders. You wouldn't find any of that virtually in the late 1990s. Over the time that I was on that board, up until a year or two ago, there was tremendous progress with respect to that. And every country in the region now has a corporate governance code. They have notions about you need to have independent directors, need to be the ones who are on the audit committee. You need to have a proper auditor. I mean, all of these things that just seem like common sense to those of us in the developed world, they weren't there at the time. Great progress has been made. I'm not going to say they're done, but great progress has been made. Why do I mention that? Because the push for that was top down. The push for that came from the regulators down. they had a tremendous effect. If it was just left up to the individual corporations, to the corporate governance culture in those countries, maybe one out of those dozen countries might have had a bit of bottom-up pressure coming along. But it was the regulators that drove it and drove it and drove it time and again. So a very beneficial, clear, long-term example of where regulators play an effective role. Here in the United States, I've been very frustrated. I've run corporations. I'm perfectly happy to live with less regulation. And I'm the first one to agree that sometimes regulations go too far. I understand that. But on the other hand, those who sort of make it a black and white issue, it's ridiculous. You're going to do away with all regulation, like what side of the street we're going to drive on, or people who inspect the food to see whether it's poisoned. I mean, it's just ludicrous to think that. And there are a couple of real examples. Very recently, there was about a few months ago, not far from where you are, Vahid, there was this E. coli outbreak at the romaine lettuce farms in the southwestern United States. Well, 2 months before that, the regulation had changed where the water on those farms had to be tested every 6 months instead of every 3 months. And the direct result was that one of those farms that was able to skip their test was the heart of the E. coli outbreak that we had directly from those farms. And you go, well, that wasn't such a good idea. Or how about the virus, the coronavirus? In 2016, before the last election, a new regulation was put in place for nursing homes. The nursing homes had to stockpile protection equipment like masks and gloves and things like that. And when the new administration came in, they said, nah, you don't have to do that. That's a waste of money. No need to do that, right? And you look back and you go, that wasn't such a good idea either, was it? So there needs to be that kind of a win-win discussion with the regulators. What makes sense and what doesn't make sense? And last quick comment, in the insurance industry, it was terribly important. You're aware, I think, that today, under healthcare laws in the United States, you are not allowed to turn down an applicant because of pre-existing conditions. You're not allowed to do that. If that law were not there, then insurance companies would have no choice but to test people for pre-existing conditions, because you could not afford to take on those risks that other companies weren't taking on. All of them would come to you, your prices would skyrocket, and you'd be out of business. It's just that simple. But the simple law that says you're not allowed to take that into account means all the insurance companies are spreading that risk, which is the whole idea of insurance, by the way, is spreading the risk. So again, it's a regulation that makes some sense. So you've hit a hot button here, I guess, but I do feel it's important to have that dialogue, and it's important to have it in a sense of what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and look at it holistically for all the stakeholders and for all of society.
Okay, questions keep piling up, but there's a third question I needed to ask you about this idea of, you mentioned briefly the idea of diversity and the value it adds to businesses. And of course, your career has been spent over in Asia. So the question then becomes, what is your approach to this idea of cross-cultural management? And because my background is also from South America, I'm also wondering what your experience is with the topic of corruption and how businesses interact with the issue of corruption. Do you have comments on that?
I do. Just to address the first part very briefly, cross-cultural management is a challenge. People come from backgrounds and with elements of experience that are just very different. I used to give a talk on the 10 commandments for doing business abroad, which was half serious, half funny. But I'd give these commandments, which were serious, and then I'd usually give a funny anecdote that went along with it. But my very first commandment was assume nothing, because it's very challenging to know what you're assuming and what you're not assuming. Case in Korea I'm familiar with, where, not to pick on Korea, this is just a cultural element, where we discovered that if you're negotiating against the government in Korea, you better be careful what law firm you're choosing, because some law firms would routinely pass on information to the government. It wasn't unethical. It was simply that in their culture, that was a higher priority than that their client was number one. And yet I would come from a culture that says, of course the client is number one. I mean, that's just baked in. Assume nothing. And then the corollary is be careful what you're assuming because you're not even aware of that. Corruption is an issue. We moved to Asia in the 80s, and corruption was an issue. I had a situation in Indonesia that I'll compare, I'll just discuss very quickly, which was that we were trying to get an insurance license in Indonesia. When I arrived, they said, yeah, you can get one, but it's going to take 2 years, or you have to pay a bribe. And I said, that's all right. It's going to take us 2 years to get ready anyway. So let's go ahead and wait. Sure enough, 23 months pass, and someone comes and says, the fellow who actually sticks your application under the Minister of Finance for his final chop has asked for a payment. Okay, now what do I do? And so I consulted with our attorney, who was the top foreign attorney in Indonesia at the time. And I wanted to understand, in the United States, we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to understand what it meant. Let me be clear, we weren't going to pay a bribe. That's for certain. But the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act at the time wasn't that old. It was only passed in the late 1970s, and this was the early 1980s. What did it mean? What did it mean as an American not to pay a bribe? It turned out there are a couple of exceptions. If you pay a facilitating payment, if you pay $50 to get your suitcase away from some manhandler in the airport, that's okay. You have to document it. You have to put it right into there, but that so-called facilitating payment was okay. But there was this discussion we had with the lawyer where local Indonesians would say, "Oh, well, there's a way to do that. You hire this administrator as a consultant." Well, that's a little obvious, isn't it? That seems kind of silly, right? And we started to talk about other possibilities. At some point, the lead attorney, my friend, this top corporate lawyer, said, "Doug, if we continue down this discussion," which at that time had gone on for about an hour, "if we continue down this discussion," he said, "you're going to find a way legal under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to pay this fellow some money. But there's a problem." And I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "It's against the law in Indonesia." I said, "You're kidding. In every list of corruption countries in the world, Indonesia is right, at one extreme." He said, "That might be, but even that $50 to the airport guy for your bag, that's against the law." Okay, that settled that. So I went on and I had a discussion with our joint venture partner. I said, "Help me understand." I said, "We're not going to pay this bribe, but how do you people do this?" He said, "Oh, that's easy. We hire the guy as a consultant." I go, "Yeah, I heard that." And he said, or just last week we had a company picnic and we hired one of the ministers to come and to give us a talk. Now, I will remind the audience, this was in the early 1980s, and the huge, very ethical organization I was with had just had a conference literally the month before where one of the members of the United States Senate came with his family to give a talk at one of our conferences. All above board, all documented, taxes paid, all of that. What was the difference? What was the difference? And the difference, it took me a while to walk through this, but the difference was in Indonesia, it was for something specific. It was for the chop. And in the United States, it was for access, right? I mean, basically, that's what it got. My point is this: it's not to beat up on Indonesia and it's not to beat up on the United States. The point is that the cultural paradigm that you have makes a huge difference. What you think is right or what's not right makes a huge difference. And Americans particularly, we think our form of democracy is better. We think our form of ethics is better. The way we're doing it is right. And I can just tell you from my cross-cultural experience, it's not.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, that gives us, again, we could go on for another hour on this topic. There's a specific question though about how can we provide a pathway for women on this topic of diversity to participate more effectively or to have a chance to at effective participation on these all white male corporate boards. What has your experience or what are your thoughts on that?
I wish I had a magic answer to that, and I'm happy that progress is being made, but it's a journey, right? Progress is being made. My career started in the mid-1970s, and I would say that my career more or less was in parallel with women coming up in the executive ranks. I was right along. About the time I started with Aetna, the first company I worked for, was about the time they promoted their first ever female to vice president level in the company, for example. I think that what I experienced, now this admittedly goes back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, but what I experienced was that many of the successful women got there by behaving like men. I say that with a comment that just says, I didn't think it was right. If it was outside of the personality that they would normally have, it often was not behaving like men, it was behaving worse. It was behaving by the reputation, bossy and mean and so forth. In my experience, and I've worked with a number of very, very successful, high-ranking women executives, they're themselves, and they help the organization to change around them, to appreciate the types of structures and the types of environment that women work in. I'm on very thin ice here because I'm trying not to stereotype. But if you allow me for just a moment, that men tend to be more competitive and hierarchical, and women tend to be more group oriented, if I could borrow that stereotype for just a moment, organizations need to be more feminine. Organizations need to be flatter. Successful organizations in Japan and elsewhere are those that work with groups. I mentioned consultation. That's a perfect example. You need to remove that. You need to lower that power distance between boss and employee. When I was in Asia, my preference was to hire women for these executive ranks. And the simple reason was that Asia is a part of the world where the culture is all about relationships. And I found, broadly speaking, that women were better at that. And some of the most successful executives I worked with were women. I don't have a magic answer. I wish I did. I don't think that the one extreme of leaning in and Sheryl Sandberg's, do it this way. I think there's some truth to that. I think there is need to speak up. I think there is the need to make the points absolutely right. On the other hand, if it goes beyond what is a natural personality for you, don't do it. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, but still make your points. On the other hand, working with the organization to create more of these relational, consultative kinds of structures, the more we do that, then the better we're going to be to have women advancing even more than they have before. And finally, Vahid, very quickly, regulation helps. And when you look at the Scandinavian countries that mandate a certain percentage of women on the board, that's exactly what ideally, we wouldn't need that. Ideally, we wouldn't need that. But just like in the corporate governance rules, it's a means to an end. If you start to mandate it now, maybe 20 years from now, you won't need it because it's just a moot point. But starting with some regulation, and that helps as well. So I hope I didn't step on any toes. I didn't really mean to. I have daughters. I've been very, very big on trying to help women advance in the market, in the workplace, and it's been a passion of mine for a long, long time.
Yeah, and we know it's a worldwide issue. It's not, unfortunately, not specific to a single culture at this point in history, at least.
It's not. Certain Asian countries, I will say, do better. Hong Kong does better than Japan. Singapore does better than South Korea. I mean, there are places that are more advanced than others.
Right. We're not going to be able to go through all the questions, but one that might be interesting. Do you have any thoughts on this idea of universal basic income? Does it, because you mentioned the issue of disparities of salaries and the 1% grabbing ever more of the pool of resources, and so I'm wondering if you've given thought to this idea.
I've given a little thought to it. I'm not an expert, but I would offer two thoughts. One is that however one does it, whether it's through universal basic income or otherwise, then our responsibility for all of humanity is to provide food and shelter and basic health care. I do believe that, and that's certainly one mechanism for doing it. My second thought is that there have been some pilots, and I have read reviews of those pilots, and the far left praised all the things that were successful, and the far right criticize and downgrade all the things that were a problem. And so it seems to me like most issues that are complex, it requires a consultation and it requires a dialogue that says, okay, well, what worked right and what can we do to further that right solution, and what went wrong and how can we avoid that for the future. So I think what's more important than the universal basic income is the objective we're trying to achieve. The objective we're trying to achieve is that basic level of humanity. How we achieve that, I think, is one that we can learn, act, reflect, learn about, and grow into organically over time.
Yeah, and part of that consultation certainly is that we need to discuss how we manage to eliminate poverty, and but also eventually, as you were looking at the different Baha'i quotations that inspired you, how we put a roof on wealth at some point too, right? Put a limit to it. So we have a question from Arthur Dahl now about trusts or corporations in monopoly positions, and how those might not have a great future in a world of justice, because monopolies, of course, present an inherent risk to economies. So how do you look at the issue of an economy that would not facilitate monopolies getting in place?
It's a challenge. Hello, Arthur. I didn't get an environment question, Vahid, from Arthur. I'm surprised. Arthur, it's a fair question, and it's one that, again, is challenging. I think there's no quick and easy solution. But if you look at the hugely successful organizations that have grown into monopolies, one might argue that Amazon or Google or some of these other behemoths are getting to that stage. Then at some point, you're going to be seeing organizations that got far afield from their initial purpose. You're going to see organizations that have diversified in a tremendous way, laterally to their suppliers and distributors, horizontally, vertically and horizontally to suppliers, shareholders, and so forth. And it comes at some point where monopolies almost by definition become conglomerates. And so I think that you can get into the point where not only is it beneficial to society to begin to look to break them up, but in most cases, in my experience, it's beneficial to the shareholder to break them up as well. Because companies that get into that position tend not to be entrepreneurial anymore. They tend not to be cutting edge anymore. And so the whole growth element that comes tends to go away. Usually, not always, but usually there comes along some radical startup that eats away at one of their little divisions and starts to make some progress, and you don't have a monopoly anymore. But you're exactly right. I think what you're talking about, Arthur, is instances where the regulations and the government also protect that monopoly. And that, it seems to me, is where you get into the dangerous spot. And so, yes, I'm in favor of looking at a balanced discussion with shareholders and regulators to say, when is the point where this needs to be broken up in a sensible kind of a way that is beneficial to everyone involved, and it's a win-win. Going back to the stakeholder model, I think that is possible, but it takes a sort of an approach and an attitude to understand that that's what's good for society longer term.
Okay, we're almost at time for wrapping up this unfortunately too short conversation. But I wanted maybe to finish on this idea that you mentioned, this time frame for establishing, making organizations work in a way that is sensible and not just attached to immediate results. 2 or 3 webinars ago, we had Jenna Nicholas discussing the idea of how in some indigenous tribes, there's this idea of generations that you have to think of when you make a decision. So you have to think 3 generations back and how the decision affects the current generation, and even 3 generations down the line. So I was wondering if this idea of a new time frame for decision making is something that could help progress towards a world of justice. And maybe what are your final thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's spot on. I mean, Jenna is brilliant. I have huge respect for her and her thoughts. I'm not familiar with that particular model you're talking about, Vahid, but from what you say, it makes perfect sense. I mentioned corporate governance a while ago. Corporate governance, one of the adages is that you need to have quarterly results. The reason for that is because there's this push from the regulators to say, I need for management to come forward with information on a regular basis. If management came through at times with important shareholder information anyway, then in theory you don't need the quarterly results, and you can give results less frequently. I think that it's a good example, Vahid, of this implementation that I was talking about, because successful companies need to be looked at over a longer period of time. You need to look at compensation systems that compensate over. You need a base pay, of course, but you need that variable pay to be over a longer period of time. ESG is a great example of a movement that helps to look at that longer period of time. And if we had compensation systems that met with that longer period of time, if we had measures of success that met with that, then we're starting to move in that direction. But there are huge hurdles in the way with our constant daily trading and stock market activity that we do. So yes, it's critically important. There are obstacles in the way. There are multiple things that we need to be working on in order to be able to try to achieve that as a mindset for the future. I love 3 generations ahead. That's a nice model.
Well, Doug, we're at time precisely. Thank you so much for sharing the wisdom and the thoughts that you've had regarding all these topics. I can see from the Q&A and the chat that there are many more questions and topics to address. Unfortunately, we won't be able to cover them today, but thank you so much for sharing with us. And again, to the audience, if you are interested in these topics, please take a look at evvf.org, where this is precisely the sort of topics that we're interested in discussing, establishing this new world civilization and creating organizations that make sense in that civilization. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. And thanks again, Doug, for participating with us.
My pleasure. Thank you. And good day to all.